Thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Annalisa Guarise and I would like to welcome all of you to our last conference of this second day of the Hikma Summit of International Relations. With this summit, Hikma is trying to deepen the analysis of the long-run crises that affect current times. Surely climate change is an issue that immediately pops into your head, and surely more than once in your personal or academic careers, you have tackled the causes or even the possible solutions for it. With Hikma, we wanted to provide an additional contribution to the reflection, shifting the focus to the institutional structure, to the political design that would eventually be able to implement concrete actions against this phenomenon. Trying to answer this question, we definitely need to start from the analysis of the international arena. Therefore, we are honored to have here today one of the most renowned academics in the field of international relations, Robert Keohane. Professor Keohane, who I deeply thank you once again for his willingness to take part in the summit, will introduce us to the issue of climate change management, investigating which could be the most effective solutions to cope with it. I then thank also Dr. Davide Fiammenghi, who is a former professor at the University of Bologna, a researcher in international relations, broad domains such as governance and international conflicts, currently under the University of Palermo, and that has kindly accepted to moderate this conference. So after an analysis of the topic by Professor Keohane and Professor Fiammenghi that will last about 45 minutes, we will leave the floor to the questions from our participants. In fact, you can ask everything you'd like to using the Slido platform. It is a tool that you can access in two simple ways. Either scan the QR code that will appear very soon on the screen, or you can simply go to slido.com and enter the code. And then there in the Q&A section, you can also ask questions, but also vote the most interesting ones. Then we also remind you that we will provide you with certifications of attendance so that a short poll will appear on your desktop to record the presence later during the conference. So here you find all the information for the Slido platform, as I said before. Prepare to be curious and to be active. And I now leave the floor to Professor Fiammenghi. Thank you. Professor Fiammenghi, I think your mic is off still.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thank you,
yes.
Annalisa. Yes. Thank you very much. As Annalisa said, we are honored to have here this evening Robert O. Keohane, who is Emeritus Professor of International Affairs at Princeton University. He's one of the most distinguished scholars of international relations. In terms of citation, I think is probably the most cited scholar in the history of international relations as a field of study. His books includes Power and Interdependence, co-authored with Joseph Nye Jr. After Hegemony, a classic book, International Relations Theory, which has had profound impact on the history of the discipline, Designing Social Inquiry, with Gary King and Sidney Verba, another classic textbook of social scientific methodology, Power and Governance in a Partially Globalized World. And then, of course, he has written or co-edited other books and is also the author of several influential articles. He has been the president of the International Studies Association and of the American Political Science Association, the recipient of several awards, including the Balzan Foundation Award, the Graham Meyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, the Johann Skytte Prize in Political Science. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of the American Philosophical Society, and of the National Academy of Sciences. He has been an editor of International Organization, which is arguably the leading journal in the field of international relations. And a prize has been named after him, the Robert Keohane Award to young and tenured scholars who get published by international organizations. Also been the mentor of many students, which went on to become outstanding scholars in their own right, like Martin, Andrew Moravchik, Helen Milner, to name but a few. So thank you, Professor. I have a set of questions for you, but before moving to the questions, I'd like you, if you don't mind, to just give us a brief overview of the topic which we are to deal with tonight. I want to give a brief overview of climate change, how you see it.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Professor Flamengi. I do want to say a few words at the outset, and then you're going to ask me a number of questions. I know we can elaborate these points in answer to the questions and also in answer to the audience's questions. I'll be brief in these initial comments. Climate change, I'm working on climate change now because I think it's a massively serious existential problem. By existential, I mean that the existence of the human race as well as other species on this planet are at stake. So it's literally existential problem. There are the best or the most scary portrayals of this tend to be in novels, which can develop scenarios of mass heat waves, mass deaths, which are not implausible. So it's an existential problem, and it's a problem for this century. For a while, it was thought maybe it was a longer future problem, but every year we get new scientific information that indicates that the problem is here now. There are already serious issues, heat waves, for example, and there are looming problems which could involve a sea level rise, which would inundate most of the world's cities, for example, if the ice sheets off Greenland or Antarctica were to melt significantly. So this is a serious multidimensional problem, and it's an urgent problem. The world has postponed working on it. So it's, despite all the warnings, the rate of emissions is still increasing. When it needs to go to zero, it's increasing every year by about 2.6%. And that's a global phenomenon. It's not so much increasing in Europe and the United States right now, but they have had the highest emissions historically. It's still increasing a lot in China and in developing countries, which have had lower emissions historically. So nobody is innocent here. And there is the collective effort is not great enough. So when we look at what's been done, the Paris Agreement is certainly an improvement over previous attempts. There was an agreement, unlike Kyoto, which had an agreement that fell apart. So Paris has an agreement, it's a universal agreement, but it was an agreement because it that is, every country could state what its national contribution would be, national indicated contribution would be, and specify the contribution itself. There were no clear metrics for evaluating and judging those contributions. So of course, all the states said, of course, we'll put a number out there and we'll tell you what we're going to do, but there's no guarantee that those actions will be taken. And in fact, if all of the Paris Agreement's actions were taken, which never happens in politics, you would still have about a 3°C increase in temperature. Well, we have to hold it to 1.5. So Paris Agreement is a little bit of a step forward, but don't be kidded that it solves the problem. It only illustrates the magnitude of the problem. So we have to pay attention. And you, who are young people, have to pay attention, especially because you're going to suffer the consequences more than those of us who are older. It may be our fault, but you're going to have to deal with it. So you have to pay attention. But I don't want to sound gloom and doom. It's far from a hopeless problem. If it were hopeless, you might say, well, just enjoy the last few years one has of human civilization. But it's not a hopeless problem, and it's not hopeless because technology has advanced so much. The rate of the cost of renewable energy has fallen by orders of magnitude in the last decade. So it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to produce solar energy and wind energy. They are now, by some metrics, they're cheaper than other forms than fossil fuel energy. If you don't worry about the fact that they're intermittent and the sun doesn't shine at night for obvious reasons, and therefore you have to have backstop power. Except for that, they are cheaper than new coal-fired or oil-fired or gas-fired plants. So we have the technology, and it's coming fast. The gap was batteries, and now batteries are improving rapidly. So that I think that unlike 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and it wasn't clear how we could possibly do this, that is, get to decarbonization. By decarbonization, I mean zero emissions worldwide, zero net emissions worldwide. You would still have some emissions. Aircraft might still have to be powered by fuel, fossil fuels partly, but you'd have some negative emissions. You'd have forest, you'd have carbon capture and storage, you'd have carbon air capture. So there'd be some negative emissions, and the key is to have net zero emissions. And most of the estimates I've seen suggest at that point you would have about 15% of the current emissions would still be there. You'd have equivalent net negative emissions, and you'd have zero. But it's a long way to get there. But it's possible. Not only possible, there's several recent reports, one from my colleagues at Princeton, my technical colleagues, it wasn't my report, one from the National Academy of Sciences of the US, but other reports as well, but I'm focusing on these two. They show pretty convincingly with lots of detail that this can be done at zero cost. Now, I have to explain what zero cost means. And if I'd said that 5 years ago, it was, you're crazy, you're not researching it properly. You're kidding us. But that's what the reports say. Essentially what it means is huge investments in renewables in the next 10 years. Electrification, triple the size of the US grid, for example. The most detailed reports are about the US economy, but you have to apply it worldwide. And you triple size of the grid, you electrify all vehicles, you no longer have fossil fuel cars and trucks. You produce lots of renewable power, mostly solar, quite a bit of wind, and you therefore get rid of fossil fuel plants. And then you develop technology for the areas which are not yet there, cement production, steel production. That requires new technology, but it's not super new. It requires a few steps, but it's not unimaginable that you have low carbon or zero carbon cement, for example. So you need to have two steps. One is huge infrastructure spending in the next 10 years on EV stations, especially, and the grid. So you electrify everything, and you run it all on renewable power. So if you electrify everything and still have coal power, you'd be doing no good at all, right? So you'd have to do both those things. And then at the same time, you're doing R&D for the long-term issues where we don't have solutions yet, like cement, aircraft fuel, and so on. And you hope and expect that the R&D efforts, if properly financed, would pay off. And then in the next decade, the 2030s and 2040s, you'd implement those new technologies which you develop in the 2020s. So there's a sequencing issue, which is laid out in these reports. And the reason that net costs are zero is you invest a lot now. Luckily, interest rates are very low. You basically borrow a lot of money to invest now in these technologies that are here. And the nice thing about solar and wind is fuel cost is zero, right? So you're investing in the infrastructure, but you're getting payback because you're not paying the oil companies for oil and gas. And so over time, it makes it roughly zero cost, but a huge investment first and then a huge payback later. So this is all, it's feasible. It's a matter of politics. And the problem is that if we all acted in a way that's perfectly individual and self-interested, we won't solve the problem because we have little incentive to invest on our own, because most of us are not paying the social cost of the emissions that we produce. So if I fly in an aircraft, if I'd flown to Italy, it would have been more fun, but a lot worse for the carbon budget. I would have essentially emitted several tons of carbon, and I wouldn't, unless I voluntarily had paid some sort of surcharge, I wouldn't have paid for that. It would have been unpriced. And if something is unpriced and it's too cheap, one uses too much of it, right? That's a pretty simple economic principle. So right now, that's where we are. All of us are using too much carbon. We're emitting too much. We're emitting more than we would if we actually had to pay the full price of it, which might involve an energy tax of $100 a ton. It might involve a little less than that, somewhere between 50 and 100. So now you in Europe are starting to pay 50. So you're ahead of the game on this, and we'll talk about that more later in the question and answer period. But the basic principle here is that we have to act collectively. This is not a problem that's going to be solved by individual action. It's nice if people do things individually, but it doesn't really solve the problem. It only solves the problem if we agree collectively to coerce ourselves and everybody else, and have a legitimate basis for doing so and a justification for doing so, which a democracy will accept. So the key issues are political. Will governments, institutions of all sorts, and publics be willing to make these investments and change their lifestyle, for the sake of solving this problem? And when I say change lifestyle, I don't think that we have to wear hair shirts or go back to a primitive lifestyle. I think we can live a pretty comparable lifestyle with a zero carbon economy. We're not going to be driving cars very much, and not going to be driving fossil fuel cars. We're not going to be flying as much in airplanes until they develop different technology. But we will be living in a cleaner environment because there are co-benefits from cutting out fossil fuel plants. You don't have particulates. You have cleaner cities, which are cleaner now for your generation than they were for my generation. That's been improved a lot. It can be improved more. So the net on net will look more like Europe, with less private auto transportation and more public transportation. I always prefer to be in a European city than an American city because of it's cleaner and it's better public transport. You don't have to worry about parking your car somewhere. But since it is a collective problem, we're going to have to ask about social norms and incentives. And most of you on this call are social scientists or aspiring social scientists. And that's our turf. So our turf is not the technology or the basic science. The basic science is actually very well known now. And the details will be brought in by natural scientists, but from a policy point of view, they don't matter a whole lot because we know how bad the problem is. And we know we're very far from the frontier. So the details of which one or another particular causal mechanism for climate change don't affect much what we should do because we're way inside that frontier. What does matter is understanding how to generate social norms and incentives so that people will voluntarily, collectively coerce themselves and pass legislation. And we're the people who should know about social norms and incentives. Anybody knows about incentives, it's economists and political scientists. Social norms are the province of political scientists and sociologists and psychologists particularly. It's our terrain, and we should understand it better and try to understand better for example, what kinds of framing of the issue will make people more ready to support climate change measures such as a price on carbon. We don't have a good answer to that question. There's a lot of uncertainties. We'll talk about it in a few minutes about when democratic publics will support a serious action on carbon. One thing we need to know from psychologists and social psychologists is what kind of framing will be effective. What kinds of political institutions are most helpful? There's some evidence that parliamentary institutions, such as most European countries have, are better than presidential, first past the post majoritarian institutions. Now, That's not 100%. The British are doing quite well, and they have a first past the post system. So like so many things, some uncertainty in this. So there's a lot more to learn about that. What kinds of institutions should we have that would foster effective action on climate change? That's a classic political science question. It's not well answered, frankly, yet, and it needs more work. So it's a great time to be a social scientist on climate change. It's the best of times, the worst of times. It's the worst of times from the point of view of the danger of climate change. It's the best of times from the point of view of opportunities to really achieve something. So you don't have to despair. You just have to get to work. Ask yourself what you're really interested in and what you're good at, and see if you can take some of that and apply it to the climate change problem. So if you're good at math and computational statistics, take that route and use some of that work to understand the problem. If you're not very good at that, but you're really good at interviewing people and intuitively seeing how they see the world, follow that direction. There's no single methodology that's going to take us there. And you don't have to say, I've got to do X methodology or else I'm not a social scientist. One great thing about social science is there's a variety of methodologies. You can be a political theorist and expand our imaginations about climate change and make a contribution. So think about the contribution you can make as a social scientist to climate change, and then go do it. So I'm going to now stop and let Professor Flamini ask me questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. While preparing for this conversation, I have reread the regime complex for climate change, which you co-authored with David Victor. It seems to me that you lamented the heterogeneity and the lack of a single overreaching normative order and of a legal order when it comes to the climate change issue. Now, you said that we should act collectively, not individually. I'd like to ask you, in terms of governance, what is the best level to tackle this issue? What do you mean with collectively? At the local level, regional level, national level, transnational level, and how?
Okay, good question. Well, I think we need to work on multiple levels. But I'm going to start with the national and international level, which is where that article focused. The article argued that this was in 2011. It was therefore when Kyoto had broken down and the Paris Agreement hadn't yet been invented. So it's sort of at a low point for climate change. And the argument was that we had a kind of fragmented regime complex. The contrast is, in certain areas of world politics, we have what some of us have called international regimes. That is, governance arrangements for an issue area. These aren't national governments. They don't have coercive power, but some of them are pretty coherent. So if you think about the IMF regime for monetary action, and especially for loans to developing countries who get in trouble, or think about the World Trade Organization with a very extensive set of trade rules. Those are classic international regimes. And take the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It's comprehensive. It covers the whole globe. It has a set of rules that are quite clear, and it has arbitration arrangements and governance arrangements, all of which I'm quite critical of some of it, but I'm not saying it's all good, but it's coherent. And you know, therefore, that if there's a trade dispute, one country that's aggravated can take it to the WTO, can eventually get, as both the US and Europe did on the Airbus Boeing issue, a decision. In that case, they both got decisions against the other one, so they were both hit by it. And you can have sanctions imposed. So that's a coherent regime. It's not like a national government. It doesn't have that much power, but it has a fair amount of authority, and it can generate incentives to keep the rules or not to break the rules, but too much, because if you break them by too much, you get in trouble. That's the regime side. The climate didn't and doesn't have that degree of coherence. You can't. There's no World Climate Organization to which you could, with a set of rules about how much carbon each country can emit, to which you could take a country and say, you're breaking those rules, you agree with this, you're not doing that, and we're going to therefore implement trade sanctions on you. We can imagine that kind of regime, but it doesn't exist. Now, Paris makes a small, maybe a baby step, but a moderate step toward that, because it is comprehensive, unlike Kyoto, and it has a institutional arrangement, and we're seeing this happen with the Glasgow conference coming up, where every country is supposed to update and defend its national indicated contribution. So each country has to say, well, this is what we agreed to in 2015. This is how much we've done toward it. This is what we're planning to upgrade it. And you're seeing the U.S. under Biden upgrading its target. Still not enforceable. If you break it, nobody's going to come down on you. It's not even monitorable very systematically. So it's a weak regime, but it's a step toward it. So we can think about a range from a no regime where there's where there are no rules. You're pretty close to that on migration now, to a regime where you have quite extensive rules like trade. They're not like the environment, but they're extensive. And climate is in the middle of that, and we need to move it up much more like the WTO system. So we need it to be more like an international regime. But we can't make our aspiration that it's a world government. It's not going to happen. It's not the nature of international politics. That would just get us into despair and trouble, because we wouldn't get there, and then we'd be unhappy that we hadn't achieved a world government, which we never will, at least not in a long time.
Thank you very much, Professor. When it comes to tackling the issue, I see two distinct approaches. Economists tend to stress the need to lowering as much as possible the cost of climate change control, whereas others tend to opt for a more distinctively political approach. How do you see it? I think you said something earlier about zero costs, if that is possible. Do you think it is reasonable to do that, as economists would like us to do, to try to strike a delicate balance between the need to, of course, curb climate change, but at the same time not overburden firms and companies and people in the third world with the cost of the transition, or rather opt for a more political approach? How do you see it?
That's a good question. I chaired a webinar yesterday with William Norton, the Nobel laureate economist, who's taken the lead on advocating for a carbon price. And I'm going to first start out by articulating his very cogent argument for this, and I'll call that the ideal world. So in the ideal world, you say, the problem essentially, as I said before in my first remarks, is that people and corporations that emit carbon or CO2 don't pay the price. So Nordhaus says, rightly so, that's an externality in economic terms, if you understand what that means. There's external cost, which is not paid by not internalized by the agent acting. What you have to do is impose a carbon price, and you make the emitter pay the cost. And there's no doubt that that would reduce carbon emissions. It would also generate a tremendous amount of money for national exchequers, which could be used in a variety of ways. So it would have double benefits in that way. And it's an irrefutable argument from the point of view of the most efficient way to handle at least a large part of the emissions problem. It's not going to handle some sectors which are particularly intensive. The carbon price has to be too high. So if you really want to deal with certain sectors like aircraft and cement and so on, you probably have to have regulations as well. But if you had in the ideal world, you had a strategy and you could control this and people would agree to it, you would impose a carbon price of something over $50 a ton right now. You'd also have regulations in sectors that will have lots of emissions anyway, unless there are standards imposed, technology standards, for example, and you'd achieve that. Now the problem is that if you look at the real world, it's a very mixed pattern. There are in fact 61 jurisdictions that have a carbon price right now. And the EU is the leading one with the EU ETS, the emissions trading system. But in almost all those cases, and the EU one is the major exception or close to an exception, those are very low prices. So California has a carbon price. It's about $16 a barrel. But California has much stronger climate regulations, but it's mostly regulation and not price. British Columbia has a carbon price, I think it's $30 a ton. Canada's thinking about it. But if you take the average carbon price, at least as Nordhaus calculated, it's only $2 to $3 a ton worldwide. And the carbon average subsidy, because fossil fuels are heavily subsidized, is about $60 a ton. So we're still subsidizing fossil fuels, which is crazy, right? So we have to change that practice. But as the varied policies indicate, it's hard because carbon prices, especially for liquid fuels, are very transparent. In the United States, at least, probably in Europe too, everybody knows how much they pay to the penny or tenth of a penny for gasoline. There's these huge signs on the gas station, $2.89.9. And if it goes up to $3.29, you notice it. People don't notice much how much they're paying for electricity, and they certainly don't notice how much their steel company is paying for the electricity, the fossil fuels that it uses to make steel. So what politicians aren't inclined, in many jurisdictions at least, to really follow the economists' advice, because politicians, we know, they want to channel their benefits to constituents. A harmonized carbon price means everybody pays the same thing, your friends and your enemies. Well, that's not how politics works. You like to channel benefits to your friends or to those who are strong and powerful and well organized, and channel the cost of those who aren't paying attention or who aren't well organized or aren't your friends, right? So there's a tension necessarily between the economics and the politics. So what we have is economic advice that's very good abstract advice, and a political reality where there's much more regulation and much less carbon pricing than you'd expect on the basis of the economic theory. So if we're working on this as social science, we have to understand this. We do political economy. We should understand both the economic logic and the political logic that leads the economic logic not to be implemented. And then as citizens, we have to ask, well, how could we actually get some sort of efficient or quasi-efficient system, which would necessarily have to include a carbon price of one kind or another. It doesn't matter if it's a tax or cap and trade. That's really a matter of indifference.
Thank you very much. Professor, in the past, there have been human rights movements and activists, what we call transnational advocacy networks. Can we draw an analogy, a parallel with these movements? Do you think they resemble somehow the current movement to curb climate change? And what role, if any, can the youth play in contrasting climate change?
Okay, this gets back to part of your first question that I failed to answer because I went in a different direction, and that is the multiple levels. So I think that these questions link up with each other. We need mobilization, and it's certainly true that the role that youth can play is especially strong here because youth are easier to mobilize than older people. They have more time, they have more energy, they're more inclined to go out in the streets, and they should, and because you have a lot, you have a lot at stake. And this show that kind of mobilization, as has been done in various climate strikes and the actions by the Swedish teenager and so on have made a big difference. So you have to show as young people that you care. If you don't care, in a sense, why should we care who are older? You have more at stake than we have. If you're indifferent, well, your problem. So you really have to get out there and mobilize. And it's a lot easier to mobilize at the city level than at the international level if you're a group of young people. So getting out there and mobilizing that way, or working. You don't have to be in the streets. You can be lobbying on social media. You can be talking to politicians. You can be interviewing politicians and asking them why they aren't doing more about climate change. I have a granddaughter who's 15 who runs a podcast every other week, not always on climate change, but sometimes on it, with New York City officials who agree to go on for half an hour and talk to her, and she can ask the questions she wants to ask. And they're going to be influenced indirectly by the kinds of questions that are asked. If young people ask questions about climate change, they're going to think, well, they worry about it. Maybe I should worry about it. So you can act, and you can act in particular ways, even if it seems small. If you multiply it by 20 million people doing the same thing, it can be big. So I think that's important. Now, what do we learn from human rights? I think what we learned two things from human rights mobilization. Well, three maybe. One is that mobilization does matter. So a lot of human rights activity, human rights treaties, even some actions by repressive regimes letting people go, comes as a result of mobilization. They don't want the bad reputation that the mobilization gives them if they're doing bad things. It doesn't always work. It's not a magic bullet, but it makes a difference, and it certainly has with human rights. The second point is, of course, human rights mobilization only works where there's some degree of openness in society. It works in democracies. It works to some extent in semi-democracies. It doesn't work in really repressive regimes where the human rights activists wind up in jail or shot. So it's another reason to work to maintain democracy, because if we don't maintain democracy in our current democracies, we're not going to be able to do anything on any issue, human rights or climate change. So imagine working on climate change and human rights now in Myanmar. Would not be a good prospect, or even in Hong Kong, which used to be a society where you could do this. So it's very important to work to make early on, so it doesn't degenerate into a situation where you can't mobilize. The other more detailed point is that the literature on human rights suggests that some combination of international and domestic action is important. That it works back and forth. If you get domestic mobilization, it can lead to other people in other countries helping you out because they see there's something happening. And you've got the international pressure on the recalcitrant government, and it reinforces the domestic actors. So there's a back and forth movement between international and domestic. We shouldn't divide them up there. Human rights mobilization, as Beth Simmons has shown, has been most effective when national domestic groups have been connected up transnationally.
Thank you very much. Some colleagues of mine, they say that political realism has relatively little to say about such an issue as climate change. Others tend to be more optimistic, and they think that perhaps realism can shed some light on the geopolitical aspects related to the energy transition How do you see it, Professor? Are there trade-offs or synergies between the need to control climate change on the one hand and the rivalries between great powers? How do you see it?
My understanding of political realism, and you know, it's funny that that group captured the label realist, which was pretty smart of them very early, because some of us think they're not always realistic. But what that label means, and I have, you know, elements of sympathy with it, is that security is the major concern of states. Security, especially military, physical security, and that we can understand international politics principally by looking at how states are concerned about threats to their security and how they see each other as threats. So we explain, therefore, realists explain alliances in terms of the enemy or the opposition. They explain war in terms of threat from one to another, and mutual threat, which can lead to war even if either side wants it. There are a lot of insights in realism, but that's the focus. So the major realist issue now globally is U.S.-China competition, because realists have always focused on great powers, especially, and they're especially interested always in the rise of a new great power, because historically the rise of a new great power has often been, not always, but often been associated with world war. So to oversimplify too much, the World War I and its sequel, World War II, are often seen as caused by the rapid rise of Germany and the inability of the system to adjust to German power. So the fear is that the rapid rise of China and the inability to adjust to Chinese power, which generates new demands for more control and more space and more influence in the world, will lead to conflict. So the first thing to say then is that, but then if you look at climate change, nothing effectively will happen unless the US and China collaborate. China is the biggest emitter. US is the second biggest emitter as a country, at least. And these are the two most important powers, and if they don't, and they account for on the order of 45% of emissions of the two of them. If they don't both collaborate, it's not going to happen. So we have a tension here. We have a tension between the geopolitical rivalry and the need for cooperation on this issue. And that is going to be a major issue in the next 10, 15 years, undoubtedly. And a major challenge for diplomacy is going to be how to manage some real collaboration on climate while there is still ongoing rivalry, because we're not going to just with a magic wand eliminate the rivalry between the US and China. So keep the rivalry from getting too hot, from becoming warlike, maintain some areas like climate, and one might hope helping developing, excuse me. Don't worry. Our apartment complex said there was going to be a test of a fire alarm system, and now that's what we have. So I apologize. I can't turn it off. I'll have to sort of wait until it stops. But it's not alarming. It was planned.
Yeah, we'll wait.
In the meanwhile, I think that in a while we could move to the question from the public just after that Professor Keohane is done with his answer. If it's okay for everybody.
Yeah, I have already taken a look at the questions.
Perfect. Yeah,
As soon
I think that we will.
as Professor Keohane is ready, we shall.
Sure. I hope you have all enjoyed the discussion until now. At least I did. And I'm sure that a lot of interesting things will come up also soon with the question from the public. I just took a glance to them, and there are really a lot. Probably we won't be able to. I hope that the most interesting ones that have been voted. Okay.
Okay, am I there again? Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad I was warned in advance that it was going to be a test. They didn't say this time, they said sometime in the next 3 days. So at least I didn't panic and think the building was on fire. Okay. So let's go to the questions, and how should we arrange it? So I take it I'll wait for which one. Is this in order?
I think we can start with the most upvoted question: how to push governments, especially Western ones, to actually create these collective international norms, given the current rise of populism and nationalism in Western countries.
Okay, good. I think the first issue is the last of part of the question. It's incumbent on all of us to try to push back against the rise in populism and nationalism. And one way to do so is to focus on, because climate is the classic collective issue. It's obvious that you can't solve the problem on your own. In fact, that's the collective action problem. Even if one country were to perfectly solve the climate problem and go to zero emissions, if no one else did, it would do a negligible amount of good. Even if the EU or the US went to zero emissions and everybody else did nothing, you would hardly notice. So the first point is to show that populism, well, populism is a complex thing. Nationalism is not a solution to the climate problem. Now, populism is a phrase, the history of populism. This was a left-wing movement. The phrase was invented in the United States, in Kansas in 1894, by people who were agrarian egalitarians. They looked much more like democratic socialists than like people who are now called populists. So be a little wary of the labels. That label is tossed around and misused a lot. But if it's the current rise in right-wing populism, which is associated with nationalism, is what's usually meant, I think the first thing is to push back against nationalism. You don't have to defend everything. I don't defend everything about the international trade and international economic regime. Some parts of it are very unfair. But you can notice two things. One, we'd all be tremendously poorer if we didn't have international trade and exchange, and poor not only financially, but poor intellectually. How many of people on this call are now sitting in a country which is not the country of their birth? If we took a poll, I would guess a third are probably doing so. And many are studying in places that are not. If that were cut off, it would be a terrible loss. And we can't solve the problems on a national basis. So the first step really back against that nationalism and that right-wing populism. The other part is to make everybody understand that you can't coerce international norms, and therefore a necessary condition is to think hard about what's essential and what's not essential. We might have, I would have certain preferences about international norms. Some of those preferences are probably based on fundamental values that, for example, those norms actually reduce emissions and therefore reduce climate change. Some are probably based on my personal tastes, aesthetic tastes, that I might like certain ways of combating climate change better than others. I might have a preference for a non-economic or for economic means. I might like regulation. I might like markets. I might have some other preferences. We should sort out which are the basic values that we care about and have to stick by and fight for, and which are just our preferences, which we have to negotiate about and compromise on. And if we all insist on our preferences, if they're this taste, we're not getting any agreement at all. If we give up our values, then we've lost the game. So think about which of your policy suggestions are based on your fundamental values, and which are based on only on what you may be able to defend, but you could give up without giving up something fundamental. So one example of that is democracy. To me, democracy is a basic value. That is some system of governance that gives the public a significant say in what policy is. That doesn't mean equal say. We know that governments are always unequal. They're always elites and publics, but a system which gives the public a significant degree of authority and which holds the elites accountable so the publics can throw out elites, at least, that behave very badly from their point of view. If that's a rough and ready definition of democracy, that, to me, that's a basic value. Now, whether that's done by a presidential system or a parliamentary one, whether it's done with lots of plebiscites or referenda, or as in California, or with no chance for referendum, as in most democracies, whether it's a bicameral or a unicameral legislature, those to me are all matters of taste, and those are matters that each particular country, with its own history and its own preferences, will have to decide for itself. So that's an example of my distinction between your tastes and your fundamental values.
Thank you.
Shall we go with the second one?
Yeah, Stefano Grandi broaches subject which we have already mentioned. He asks whether climate change will be a driver of more cooperation rather than conflict, and how will the balance of power change during the energy transition? That's a great question. First, I'll go back to one of the books that Professor Flemenge mentioned. One of the key points of my book, After Hegemony, is that cooperation comes out of discord, not out of harmony. If you have harmony, you don't need cooperation. For example, we don't have to have cooperation in Italy or the United States to make sure that you drive on the right-hand side of the road. You don't think every day, oh, drive on the right or drive on the left, what shall I do? Maybe I should have a bargain about this. You know, if you drive on the left, you'll be killed, right? And you'll kill somebody else probably too. So that's a pure harmony situation. Once you've agreed to drive on the right, you drive on. Now it's just a matter of, it's arbitrary convention. If you go to England, you better drive on the left. If you drive, that's where they drive. That's a pure harmony situation. Airline pilots all speak English. That's close to harmony, right? It'd be terrible to have pilots speaking one language and air traffic controllers speaking something else. So they simply agree on English, even though Italians might prefer Italian and French would prefer French. So that's a harmony situation. But usually, and then you don't need much cooperation or any cooperation. You need cooperation where you have discord, where you have different preferences and different distributions. And so climate change will be a matter of cooperation and discord, because how you do it is going to affect who pays for it, right? If you have a climate tax, do you refund the amount back to individuals? Then payment is one way. Or do you send funds to the central government for spending on social welfare? That's a different distribution of the resources. And clearly, not everybody will agree on which is better. So climate change can be a driver of cooperation because there is a huge joint benefit. And the theory I put forward of cooperation depends on there being a huge joint benefit. If there were no joint benefit, that is, if it didn't matter how we acted, then you wouldn't have cooperation. But we ought to have lots of cooperation because of the huge joint benefit. We ought to also expect to have a lot of discord about how that benefit is, how the costs of achieving that benefit are allocated, because all of us are going to want to shift the costs onto somebody else. And that's the nature. What we have to do is to emphasize the huge magnitude of the benefits and the existential problem of climate change. That is, if we don't cooperate, we're all going to be fried, literally.
And that should generate cooperation. Now, I think it's going to be a hard, messy process. Human beings are very good at conflict and discord, and not cooperation takes a lot more work and a lot more effort. How will the balance of power change during the energetic transition? Well, one of the hopeful things about cooperation is that if it was just costly to reduce emissions, it would be really hard to do it because each country would try to hope others will do it, and they wouldn't. Now it's becoming evident that the countries that lead in the energy transition, the transition to renewables, will gain a big step up on technology. And technology follows Moore's law. If you do a lot of something, it becomes a lot cheaper to do it because you know how to do it better, and then you become the global leader in it. So if cheap energy, renewable energy is going, as I believe it will be, it's going to become a major industry of the 21st century, then a wise country, even if the leaders don't care about climate change, ought to invest a lot in it because it'll make them the leaders for it. The way China has become a leader in solar technology in the current generation. And so that's a positive hope that it could generate a race to the top and not a race to the bottom.
I'd stay with Stefano Grandi's question for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When it comes to the balance of power, China at the moment seems to be on top in the supply chain of the renewable. And some analysts and pundits, they fear that by investing in renewable, Europe is actually financing its own future vulnerabilities because of a problem on dependency on foreign. How do you see the problem of the supply chains and the fact that some countries, some powerful countries, may have an advantage, may be imposed by the energy transition?
I think that governments have to think about climate policy as both climate policy and industrial policy. And Germany failed to do that when it decided to have a feed-in tariff. That was great climate policy, but they purchased the ingredients from China and they drove Chinese manufacturing, and that was bad industrial policy. So I wouldn't exclude certain limited degree of preference for one's own. If it's a trade-off, if you either suppose that you're not going to do this unless you generate jobs at home, then I think it's okay to have some buy American or buy EU of provisions, especially if the government is financing the basic research. So if you have a situation where you have basic research, which is not commercializable, which the government finances, and then after some point, it comes close enough to commercialization where private industry finances it. There's a very good case normatively and economically for the government of the country getting back its investment and getting a profit on its investment. It made it possible. And that may require that local countries that are paying local taxes get the benefits of the investment. So I think that we can be in favor of a world where there's lots of cooperation without having to say it's got to be totally open and everything is given to everybody. Because otherwise, if that means that there's no incentive for the government in the first place to finance the innovation, then you're back at point zero and you haven't achieved anything.
Thank you very much.
So we should not think in these simplistic categorical terms of free trade or protectionism. Lots of variation. There's some kinds of domestic preference that are perfectly well justified, as I just said. And some of Biden's plan, President Biden's plans in the U.S. seems to me are justified in that way. And there are other types that aren't justified. They're simple protection. We have to have a sense to sort these out.
Thank you very much. Professor, there are three questions which perhaps we may need together. One is by Ingrid Salvadori, one by Samita Gina, sorry if I don't pronounce the name correctly, and then an anonymous. They point to conflict of interest between Western countries and developing countries, because a recurrent topic that Western countries achieve their impressive economic development by using fossil fuels. And at the same time, they are lecturing us about the excessive use of fossil fuels and the risk that they may damage the climate of our planet. How do you see this conflict of interest in countries and developing countries? If you admit that there is a conflict of interest, or if you think otherwise, please let us know your opinion.
Well, on the first question, there certainly is lots of unfairness. There's history is full of injustice. And that the West, thanks to fossil fuels, and used up much of the carbon budget. That is a matter of injustice, and it's unfair. And it is also a matter of the past. And at most of that time, not the last 20 years, most of that time, people were not aware of that this was a constraint. But there it is, that's happened. So the way to cope with the argument is not to say, well, let the developing countries use fossil fuels in enormous abundance so they catch up with it, even if it destroys the planet. That's not a particularly good response. But it does put an obligation on Western countries to finance development, high technology, low emissions development in developing countries. And so it means that we as citizens of rich countries have an obligation to push for more support. It may not be financially, it may be technology transfer, more support for developing countries to help them skip over much of the coal transition right to renewables. And actually, most developing countries are in very good situations because they're mostly tropical countries, and many of them have lots of land, and there's a lot of capability for solar power in most developing countries. So that if we were to actually help them develop solar power, which is now very cheap, they could leapfrog some of these problems. They could avoid some of the terrible pollution that afflicts cities in industrializing countries that afflicted London in the 19th century and Delhi now. So there are ways to do it, but it's not by going backward and saying we have to feel guilty or make up for these things. It's by saying, what can we do to help solve the problem and to make the future more just and more effective than the past. Now, on Julia Hodgkin's question, I think I would turn the question around. That is, I think that enforcing standards on private companies and state factories is always going to be hard. It's going to be hard. That is, if those are standards which those companies don't want to follow, it requires not only the political will to overcome the resistance of very powerful organized interests, but also requires implementation consistently over time. So the first thing I would ask is there a way to provide incentives of where those companies and state factories will actually want to act this way? And that's where the Nordhaus idea of a carbon price matters a lot. So suppose that you have the European ETS system working fully at a high carbon price, say $100 a ton. And it means that if a company, reduces carbon emissions, it saves money. And it might even mean that it earns money, because if it meets a certain target for it, maybe it's being paid for its large amount of carbon emissions reduction. So then you don't have to enforce anything on them. You give them an opportunity to make profits by doing the right thing. There's a new novel called Ministry of the Future by a man named Robinson, Kim Robinson. And he imagines that the world's central banks invent something called, I think it's a climate coin or something like that, like Bitcoin, but any enterprise which saves X amount of carbon, say 1 million tons of carbon, will receive a coin worth a lot of money, exchangeable into any currency. So the idea there is to use the central banks to provide incentive to these firms. But the basic idea is if you give incentives to state companies and private companies to reduce carbon footprint, save carbon, then you don't have to implement everything. You don't have to follow their every move and try to make sure your inspectors are not corrupted and make sure that things are consistent. And a lot of things will happen automatically, and that's the power of the market response. Now, the third question here: U.S. environmental policy has changed 180 degrees with the Biden presidency. I'm very enthusiastic. You can complain about this aspect or that aspect of base tremendous change. So Trump was going in the wrong direction, call it going south, and Biden is going directly north. It's a 180-degree turn, and I think that the emphasis on infrastructure and jobs is politically smart. So I talked about carbon price. Carbon prices right now in the U.S. would not be popular. It'd be a way to destroy your political base. So they're very intelligently focusing on building infrastructure, emphasizing the jobs that will be created by that, electric vehicle charging stations. But they're gonna increase regulation. They're gonna do whatever they can to solve the climate problem. Now, will it be enough? The big question is not their intention, because they are really committed. And it is a government-wide. It's very impressive that it's a government-wide action. Every department is tasked to work on climate change. The real question is whether the administration, the Democratic Party, will stay in power long enough to be able and have enough authority to implement these measures and put them into law in a way that can't be changed by the next administration.
I think we have time for one more question. So please, Mr. Fiamengi.
Yeah, I think we have already addressed the problem of third world countries, which Samita Jina is mentioning. Countries shift to renewable. We have already addressed this question too. Let me see from the side. The United States wanted to withdraw from the WHO during the pandemic and isolationist act. Do you think the US will be able to lead the green transition, or someone else will?
Well, the U.S. is coming back hard into both organizations because that was a distinctively Trump policy, right? So you have to distinguish between two aspects of the U.S. The U.S. has not been, through administrations, a great advocate of a number of, let us say, normatively driven international initiatives, like the International Criminal Court or the Landmines Treaty. And neither Democratic nor Republican administrations have been strongly in favor of those. It hasn't joined. The other hand, the U.S. was a leader in the WTO negotiations. In fact, pushed the Europeans to because they made a deal. The U.S. made a WTO. Now, the U.S. was, of course, a founding member of WHO and other specialized UN agencies. And it has been pretty, Democratic administrations have been pretty consistent advocates of these kinds of organizations. So we're seeing a return to these organizations which perform valuable functions for the United States from an administration which believes in international cooperation when they perceive it to be in the interest of the United States. They aren't the U.S. is never ideologically in favor of more and more international law and more international institutions. It's a much too sort of independent-minded country for that. But where it's persuasive, as in the case of WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, and climate change, America's into that. The U.S. has been usually the leader on multilateralism. So I think we'll go back into such is in a leadership position on those initiatives which seem to be important for the United States interests, and certainly climate change is one of them.
Is there time for another question? I'd like to ask something to Professor Keohane, if there is time.
Yeah, well, maybe one, yeah.
You mentioned solar and wind, but if I'm not mistaken, during the whole conversation, you had never mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps I miss it, nuclear power. How do you see nuclear power? Can it play a role, if any?
We have not mentioned nuclear power, and it's politically fraught, as you know. After all, Germany decommissioned its nuclear power stations and went back to the dirtiest kind of coal as replacement on environmental grounds. It's kind of crazy from the climate point of view. But nuclear power generates a lot of emotion relative to the degree of risk. So it has two features that make it problematic. One is that there is a non-zero risk, as Fukushima indicates, and as 3 Mile Island in 1979 indicates. It's a non-zero risk of some sort of nuclear accident, which could be very, very serious. That's a real risk. It's a very small risk, but it is a risk. It doesn't exist with other power sources that don't have that catastrophic potential. It's also a high technology, very engineering heavy, and now very expensive form of construction. It takes a long time to build these plants, and under current conditions, at least, it's very expensive. So the combination of these has made it politically difficult in many countries, but not at all. As you probably know, some of you on this call are French. In France, it's perfectly unproblematic. French have had a nuclear power as the basis of their electricity system. It's like 2/3 of French electricity is nuclear. They never had a major accident. It's the public is not upset about it. And some publics, the US public, the German public, get very upset about nuclear power. So it's heavily cultural and emotional. And one of the reasons that it's not part of the mix, I think, in the US right now, Biden has not emphasized it, is that the narrow coalition that is supportive of climate change action includes a lot of people who are anti-nuclear for various reasons, good, bad, and indifferent. And so if you want to build a coalition which is for renewables, you're probably not smart to include nuclear, because the big supporters of nuclear are often the Republican types who want the high-tech engineering solutions, and they're not going to support your plan anyway. So if you think about it, if you thought about it purely technically, nuclear should be part of the mix, and most of the reports ideally call a solution, we'd have nuclear part of the mix. And once again, it's the politics is not in line with this case, that the technology. If you look at it politically, you think, well, maybe we shouldn't do that any more than we should put all our weight on carbon prices. It's not going to fly politically. Let's think that'd be the second best solution technically, but might be more feasible politically. And about this whole discussion, we have this relation between what the technical or the economic analysis shows and what the political analysis shows. And the mark of a successful politician is somebody who will still achieve the objective at somewhat reasonable cost in a way that's politically acceptable and that can be sold in his or her country, and it'll be a different formula in different countries. It won't be the same worldwide. So, for example, in Europe, it's taking the form of cap and trade because that fits well with the way the Europeans can legislate and act. In the U.S., it's almost certainly if the U.S. gets a carbon price, it'll be a tax, which is simpler, easier to understand, easier to fit into the constitutional system. So those details will vary. But nuclear, I'm afraid, in some countries it's quite feasible, but in many, including the U.S. and Germany, it's not something you want to pursue.
I think that now we are a little bit running out of, so thank you so much for the reflection. I think that you stressed several points that aren't often taken into account when tackling this issue. I would say that normally the focus is more on the policies. A reflection on who should promote policies is sometimes avoided. So you surely provided us much food for thought. And from now on, we will have a new tool when addressing the discussion over climate change. At the end, as you said, it's not an hopeless problem. So once again, thank you very much, Professor Keohane. It has been more than an honor to have you here. We'll be waiting for you directly in Italy next time.
I love Italy. I will look forward to it. Florence is one of my favorite cities in the world. So, and I have some very close friends in Italy.
Next time.
Thanks
to Professor to guide us into this reflection. Thanks to the many participants for the interest you have demonstrated towards the topic, and I therefore invite the ones that among you have been selected for the Meet the Speaker to remain in this room, as well as Professor Keohane, and for everyone else, stay tuned on our social media channels, especially for all the events that will come up in the next days. And see you tomorrow for the third day of the Hikma Summit of International Relations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.